Hi everyone, welcome to Mountain Home Stories. I hope you have been reading along with me. I've been reading the illustrated classics in an abridged form, and I already have 2 videos on this. If you haven't read those stories, you can check out the videos in my channel. You'll get those stories there. And a gentle reminder, if you're new to my channel, please do consider subscribing to it. And today I'm going to start off with Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Read along with me. One morning in June 1751, I took the key for the last time out of the door of my father's house. Mr. Campbell, the minister of Essendine, was waiting for me. He gave me a letter addressed to Ebenezer Balfour of the House of Shaws, saying, "Your father asked me to give this to you after he died. It is your inheritance." "The House of Shaws?" I cried. "What had my poor father to do with the House of Shaws?" "The name of that family is the name you bear, Balfour of Shaws, an ancient, reputable house, but in these latter days decayed," Mr. Campbell replied. I set off for the House of Shaws. After 2 days of walking, I reached the house and knocked on the door. I waited for a long time. Finally, a man put his head out of a window and asked, "Who are you?" "They call me David Balfour," I replied. At that, I thought the man started. After a long pause, the next question followed. "Is your father dead?" I was so surprised that I could find no voice to answer but stood staring. "He'll be dead, no doubt. I'll let you in," said the man. The door was cautiously opened and shut again behind me. I was taken to a kitchen where the table was laid for supper. In the light of the fire, I saw a mean, stooping, narrow-shouldered man. He took the letter from me and said cunningly, "So, you have come to me with some hopes, no doubt?" "I did indulge the hope that my kinsfolk might help me in my life," I replied. After I had eaten, he showed me to my room and locked me in. The next morning, I knocked and shouted till I was let out. The day passed fairly well. After dinner, my uncle said, "Here's the key of the stair tower. Go up the stairs and bring me down the chest that's at the top." The wind was moaning in the distance. I felt my way in the pitch darkness with a beating heart. A flash of lightning showed me that the steps were of unequal length, and one of my feet rested that moment at the very edge. Suddenly, I put out my hand and found emptiness beyond. The steps ended there. My uncle had sent me there, certainly to run great risks, perhaps to die. The mere thought brought up the sweat upon my body. I groped my way down the stairs carefully. I was full of anger. I demanded an explanation for his strange behavior. Why had he tried to kill me? "I'll tell you in the morning," my uncle said in a broken voice. He seemed so weak that I had to agree. The next morning, a boy called Ransom brought a letter for my uncle from Captain Hoseason. My uncle promised to explain everything after meeting the captain at Hawes Inn in Queen's Ferry. He said, "I'll tell you everything at Mr. Rancular's house. You'll believe Rancular. He's a lawyer and a respected man." "Very well," said I. "Let's go." While the captain and my uncle talked at the inn, Ransom and I began eating and drinking with a good appetite. The captain invited me to have a look at his ship. I had never been on board a ship, so I agreed. A boat took us close to the ship. I was taken up to the deck. As I looked about delightedly, I suddenly remembered my uncle. I cried out in horror when I saw him sailing away in the boat. It was the last I saw of him. A thunderbolt seemed to strike me. I saw a great flash of fire and fell senseless. I came to myself in darkness and great pain. A sailor called Mr. Riark dressed my wound. As I slowly recovered, I learnt that the ship was bound for the Carolinas. My wicked uncle had condemned me to a life of slavery on the plantations. The cabin boy, Ransom, came in at times from the roundhouse, where he berthed and served. Sometimes he nursed a bruised limb in silent agony, and sometimes raved against the cruelty of Mr. Shuan, the captain's chief mate. One night, 2 seamen appeared, carrying ransom in their arms. His face was as white as wax. The blood in me ran cold. The poor boy was dead. I ran out to the deck in terror. After Ransom's death, I was given the duty of serving in the roundhouse. One foggy night, we ran down a boat. She sank with all her crew except for one man, who had saved himself by catching hold of the brig's bowsprit. The man took out some guineas from a money belt round his waist and said, "I'm an honest gentleman who was bound for France. There was a French ship cruising here to pick me up, but she gave us the go-by in the fog. If you can set me ashore where I was going, I will reward you highly for your trouble." The captain eyed the belt greedily, agreed to set him down on the Linney lock, and went away. The man then asked me for a drink. "I'll go and ask for the key," said I, and stepped on deck. The captain with his 2 officers were whispering together. I learned that they were planning to kill the gentleman for his money. I was seized with both fear and anger at these treacherous, greedy, bloody men. My first mind was to run away. My second was bolder. "Captain," said I, "the gentleman wants a drink. Will you give me the key?" Seeing me, the captain had an idea. He told me to quietly bring out a few firearms from the roundhouse where the man was sitting. "David, my man, the wild Highland man is a danger to the ship, besides being a foe to King George. God bless him," Hoseason added. I told him I would do as he wished. What else was I to do? But when I came into the roundhouse, I walked right up to the table and told the man, "Do you want to be killed? They are all murderers here. They've murdered a boy already. Now it's you." "But they haven't got me yet," the man replied. Then he looked at me curiously and said, "Will you stand with me?" "That I will," said I. "I'm no thief, nor yet murderer. I'll stand by you." "What's your name?" "David Balfour of Shaw's," said I. "My name is Stewart," he said. "Alan Breck, they call me." Then he turned to examine our defences. The roundhouse was built very strong. Only the skylight and the 2 doors were large enough for the passage of a man. The doors could be closed. The one that was already shut I bolted securely. When I was proceeding to shut the other, Alan stopped me. "David, that door being open is the best part of my defences. So long as that door is open and my face to it, the best part of my enemies will be in front of me." He gave me a cutlass from the rack, choosing it with great care. Then he set me down at the table with a powder horn, a bag of bullets, and all the pistols. "Keep on charging the pistols, and give heed to me," he said. "First of all, how many are against us?" 15, said I. Alan whistled and said, "Well, that can't be helped. I shall guard this door." "But then, sir," said I. "That is a part of your work," replied Alan. "You must keep watch at the window. If they try to enter through that door, you are to shoot." Scarce had Alan spoken when the captain showed his face in the open door. "Stand!" cried Alan, and pointed his sword at him. The captain gave me an ugly look and was gone. The attack came all of a sudden, with a rush of feet and a roar, and then a shout from Alan and a sound of blows and everyone crying out as if hurt. I looked back over my shoulder and saw Mr. Schwan in the doorway, crossing blades with Alan. Others soon followed Mr. Schwan. Alan drove the sailors along the deck as a sheepdog chases sheep. They ran before him in haste. He was soon back again. Alan and I were victorious and unhurt. Alan cut off one of the silver buttons from his coat and gave it to me, saying, "Wherever you show that button, the friends of Alan Breck will come to help you." Soon the captain came to make peace with us. Alan told the captain to set him down within 30 miles of his country. Late at night, the captain cried out, "My brig's in danger! The sea is breaking on a reef!" Suddenly a huge wave lifted the brig right up and canted her over. I was cast clean into the sea. I grabbed a beam that was floating past. In about an hour, I reached Sandy Bay. I kicked and swam till I reached dry land. After resting for a while, I began to explore my surroundings. I realized that I was cast upon a barren isle. I wept in despair at my condition. I passed 2 days eating raw shellfish and hoping for rescue. The third day, a cobble carrying a pair of fishermen passed by. I shouted out to them. The men showed me a way to go across to the main island. I walked till I came upon a house at night. The old gentleman there told me that my shipmates had gone ashore safely and had been in that very house for some time. "You are to follow your friend to his country by Torsay," he said. At Torsay, I showed the skipper of a boat Alan Silverbutton. He told me to go to the house of James of the Glens at Auchan. As I walked along, I saw 4 travellers coming up the road. I asked one of them the way to Auchan. But just as he turned, there came a shot from up the hill, and the man fell down dead. I scrambled up the hill, crying out, "The murderer! The murderer!" The travellers ran after me, shouting, "Catch the boy! He is with the murderer! He was sent here to keep us talking." Hearing this, I ran for my life. "Duck in here among the trees," said a voice close by. I was surprised to see Alan Breck hiding there. "Come," said he, and began to run. After a while, Alan stopped. We lay down on the ground, panting for breath. Alan swore he had not murdered the traveller, but to avoid suspicion, he said that both of us should flee that country. Night fell as we walked. We went over rough mountains. At last, we reached the house of James Stewart. I was given a change of clothing and a pair of Highland brogues. By the time I had changed, Alan must have told his story, for they seemed to understand that I was to fly with him, and they were all busy readying our equipment. They gave us each a sword and pistols, some ammunition, a bag of oatmeal, an iron pan, and a bottle of French brandy. With all these, we were ready for our journey. We said farewell and set out again. Our destination was a cleft in the head of a great mountain. Birches grew there and pines too. A burn running through its midst was full of trout. The 5 days we stayed there went by happily. From there we travelled hard for many days till we reached Loch Rannoch. We crossed Loch Rannoch and travelled through eerie mountains, often buried in mist, almost continually blown and rained upon, and not once cheered by any glimpse of sunshine. It was dreadful. I was never warm. We walked with the rain driving in our faces. By the 3rd night, I was weary and quite sick. We took shelter in the house of one of Alan's clansmen. It took me a month to recover. Our money was now run so low that we had to reach Mr. Rancular quickly, or we would surely starve. We set off again, and after many weary days of travelling, we finally reached Queensferry. Alan waited by the highway while I went in search of Mr. Rancular. We fixed up a meeting place for the next night. I saw a gentleman coming out of a fine house and asked him the way to Mr. Rancular's house. "I am Mr. Rancular," he said. "Come in." I told him my story and said I believed I had some rights on the estate of the Shaws. Mr. Rancular asked me a few questions to confirm that I really was David Balfour. Then he said, "The estate is yours beyond a doubt, but your kidnapping may be difficult to prove. Your uncle told me you had taken your share of money and gone to Europe. My advice is to leave your uncle where he has taken root for a quarter of a century and content yourself in the meanwhile with a fair provision." Mr. Rancular, Alan, and I went to my uncle's house. Alan tricked him into admitting that he had paid Hoseason £20 to kidnap me. Then I stepped forward and said, "Good evening, Uncle Ebenezer." My uncle sat like a man turned to stone. The lawyer took him by the arm and led him in. Mr. Rancular and my uncle went to another room to work out a suitable agreement. According to the agreement, my uncle was allowed to keep the house and lands. He had to pay me 2/3 of the yearly income of the Shaws. The next morning, it was time for Alan and me to part. "Well, goodbye," said Alan and held out his hand. "Goodbye," said I. Neither one of us looked the other in the face. I did not glance back at the friend I was leaving. But as I went on my way to the city, I felt lost and alone and could have wept like a baby. So with this, we come to the end of this Illustrated Classics, Kidnapped. I hope you enjoyed reading this story. Our next story is going to be The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Tom! Tom! No answer. Now where's that boy? Tom! Aunt Polly heard a slight noise behind her and turned round just in time to seize a small boy by his clothes and arrest his flight. There! You've been in that cupboard stealing jam again, haven't you? She said, picking up her cane. Why, look behind you, Aunt! Aunt Polly turned round and the lad fled, jumped over the fence and disappeared. Later that evening, Tom came home covered with dust after a fight. His aunt decided to punish him by making him paint the fence that weekend. Saturday came. Tom appeared on the sidewalk with a bucket of whitewash and began to paint the fence. Then an inspiration burst upon him. When Ben Rogers came along, munching on an apple, Tom paid no attention. Say, I'm going swimming. But you'd rather work, wouldn't you? Said Ben. Tom resumed his whitewashing and answered carelessly. You call this work? Does a boy get a chance to whitewash a fence every day? That put things in a new light. Ben said, Tom, let me whitewash a little. Tom considered, but changed his mind and said, No, Ben, Aunt Polly is very particular about this fence. Let me try, Tom. I'll give you my apple. Tom gave up the brush with reluctance on his face, but joy in his heart. While Ben sweated in the sun, Tom munched his apple. As the day went on, other boys came along to jeer, but remained to whitewash. They traded their things with Tom to be allowed to paint the fence. By the afternoon, Tom was rolling in wealth and the fence had 3 coats of whitewash on it. On Monday morning, Tom met Huck Finn, son of the town drunkard. Huck came and went of his own free will. He did not have to attend school or church or call anyone master. Huck showed him a dead cat and said he was planning to cure warts with it at the graveyard that night. How do you do that, Huck? Asked Tom. You take your cat and go to the grave of someone wicked about midnight. A devil will come and take that fellow away. You push your cat after it and say, Devil, follow corpse. Cat follow devil, warts follow cat, and done with ye. They will come after the corpse of old horse Williams tonight. You can come if you aren't afraid. Tom promised to meet him at the graveyard. That night, Tom and Huck met at the graveyard. Suddenly, they heard voices. Shh! Huck whispered suddenly. That's Muff Potter's voice. And that's Injun Joe and the doctor, said Tom. The men reached the grave. Potter and Joe began digging while Dr. Robinson watched. When the diggers struck the coffin, they opened the lid, removed the body and dumped it on the ground. Then they placed the corpse in a wheelbarrow. Potter said, Now you'll have to pay another 5. What does this mean? Asked the doctor. I've paid you in advance. Injun Joe threatened the doctor, who struck out suddenly and stretched him on the ground. Don't you strike my partner, said Potter. He began to grapple with the doctor. Joe sprang to his feet and circled the 2 men with a knife, seeking an opportunity. The doctor seized a heavy plank and hit Potter. In the same instant, Joe drove the knife into the doctor's breast. The doctor fell down on Potter. The 2 frightened boys rushed away. Joe put the knife in Potter's open right hand and waited. When Potter recovered, Joe asked him why he had killed the doctor. Poor Potter could not remember anything and cursed himself for being so drunk. Joe told Potter to flee and promised not to tell anyone. Tom was in love with Becky Thatcher, the new girl in school. But when he tried to show off in front of her, she merely turned away from him, saying, Some people think they are mighty smart. Tom's cheeks burned. His mind was made up now. Nobody loved him. He decided to lead a life of crime. He met Joe Harper and said he'd made a resolution to escape the lack of sympathy at home by going out into the great world never to return. Joe had the same plans. His mother had unjustly whipped him for drinking cream. They decided to become pirates. Huck joined them too. They planned to meet at midnight by the river and set off for Jackson's Island. That night they found a raft and rowed to the island. On landing at the island, they built a fire and ate merrily. Gradually their talk died out and they slept. The next morning, Tom stirred up the other pirates. They soon stripped and chased and tumbled over each other in the water. After breakfast, they lay down in the shade and talked. A strange longing crept over them. It was homesickness. Too ashamed of their weakness, no one spoke aloud. As twilight drew on, the pirates returned to their camp. The next morning, they saw people on a ferry boat looking for them. At once, they felt like heroes. They were missed. They were mourned. They were the talk of the whole town. That night, Tom began to feel homesick. He slipped away and went home. He climbed over the fence and looked in through the window. He saw Aunt Polly and Joe Harper's mother talking. Tom entered quietly and hid under the bed. "But as I was saying," sobbed Aunt Polly, "he was not bad, only mischievous. He never meant any harm, and he was the best-hearted boy that ever was." "It was the same with my Joe," Mrs. Harper moaned. They flung themselves into each other's arms and cried. Then they parted. Tom waited till Aunt Polly was asleep. Then he kissed her and stole out. He returned to the camp and recounted his adventures. The next night, all the boys decided to go home. Tom had a secret plan. That Sunday, the entire village gathered in the church to mourn the death of the boys. The minister related several incidents from the lives of the departed. The church door creaked. The minister raised his tearful eyes and stood transfixed. Everyone stared as the 3 dead boys came marching up the aisle. They had been hiding, listening to their own funeral sermon. Aunt Polly and the Harpers threw themselves on their children and kissed them. Huck stood by uncomfortably. Finally, Tom said, "Aunt Polly, somebody's got to be glad to see Huck." Aunt Polly at once lavished Huck with loving attention. This was Tom's great secret plan, to return home with his brother pirates and attend their own funerals. One morning at school, as Becky was passing the master's desk, she noticed that the key was in the lock. She had seen the master keep a mysterious book in it. Finding herself alone, she took out the book and opened it. It was a book on anatomy. She turned the pages and came at once upon a human figure. At that moment, Tom stepped in and saw the picture. When Becky saw Tom, she hastily shut the book, but it tore at the picture page. Becky put down the book in the desk. The master came in and waited for the children to settle down. He gave them some work and then unlocked his desk and took out the book. Becky and Tom watched him closely. When the master saw the torn page, he said, "Who tore this book?" Becky raised her hands in fear. A thought struck Tom. "I did it," he shouted. The class was stunned. Tom was punished severely, but the adoration in Becky's eyes was worth it. That night, Tom went to bed happily, with Becky's words lingering dreamily in his ears. "Tom, how could you be so noble?" One day, Tom and Huck decided to look for buried treasure in the haunted house in the valley. They examined the place. Suddenly, they heard some sounds. "Shh! Hear it, Huck? Someone's coming." The boys stretched themselves upon the floor with their eyes glued to the holes in the planking. 2 men entered the room below. They dug out a box full of gold coins. "Let's take the money to my den at number 2, under the cross," said one man. The boys gasped. It was Injun Joe's voice. The 2 men left the house with the box. Tom and Huck concluded that number 2 referred to a room in the village tavern. The next night they hung about the tavern, but nobody resembling Injun Joe entered or left the tavern. Nothing happened for the next 2 days. On Thursday night, Tom slipped out with his aunt's old tin lantern. The 2 boys crept towards the tavern. Huck stood guard and Tom felt his way into the alley. Suddenly, Tom came charging back saying, "Run! Run for your life!" The boys did not stop till they reached the lower end of the village. Tom said, "Huck, number 2 was unlocked, and when I crept in, I almost stepped on Injun Joe's hand. He was lying there sound asleep on the floor." "Tom, did you see that box?" "No, I didn't see the cross either." The 2 boys decided that Huck would keep watch and let Tom know if Joe went out. Then they would steal the box. Tom's excitement kept him awake late that night, but no signal came from Huck. Next morning, A happy group gathered at Judge Thatcher's. Becky had got her mother to arrange a picnic to a nearby cave. Becky's mother told her to stay the night at Susie Harper's house, as they would be returning late after the picnic. As they tripped along, Tom said to Becky, "Let's stop at the widow Douglas's tonight. She'll have ice creams, and she'll be glad to have us." Becky said, "But what will Mama say?" "She won't know," replied Tom. Becky agreed to Tom's plan. The ferry boat stopped at the mouth of a wooded hollow. The group came ashore, and soon the forest echoed with their shouting and laughter. They feasted and they rested under the oaks. After a while, they set off to explore the cave. Within the cave, many paths branched off from the main avenue. Tom and Becky wandered away in one of these paths. By and by, one group after another came back to the mouth of the cave. It was already dark, and they rushed to the ferry boat. No one realized that Tom and Becky had not returned. Next morning, Judge Thatcher's wife met Mrs. Harper at church and said, "Is my Becky going to sleep all day?" "Your Becky?" "Yes. Didn't she stay with you last night?" "Why, no." Mrs. Thatcher turned pale. Just then Aunt Polly passed by and said, "I suppose Tom stayed at one of your homes last night?" "He didn't stay with us," replied Mrs. Harper. The people began questioning those who had gone on the picnic. No one had seen Tom and Becky return. The alarm went through the village. Men rushed to the cave. 3 days passed. The town waited anxiously. There was no news and no hope left of finding the two children. Meanwhile, Tom and Becky had realized that they were lost in the cave. They were now truly frightened. Then Tom had an idea. He took a kite line from his pocket, tied it to a rock, and they both started exploring. Tom in the lead, unwinding the line as he groped along. As they wandered about, Tom saw somebody holding a candle and gave a shout. But the children were horrified to see it was Injun Joe. Tom was paralyzed. The next moment, he was grateful to see Joe take to his heels. Tom and Becky followed a passage till they saw what looked like daylight. They climbed out of a hole and hailed some men passing by on a boat. The men took them home. Later, Tom told Huck, "I'm sure the money is in the cave. Will you come and help me find it?" Huck agreed. They set off for the cave and explored it till they found a cross marked on a big rock. "Remember, Injun Joe said number 2 was under the cross?" said Tom. They began to dig and found the box of gold coins hidden below some boards. "We are rich, Tom," said Huck. They took the money to the widow Douglas's house. It was over $12,000. Tom and Huck's windfall caused a stir in the little village of St. Petersburg, and everyone formed a great opinion of Tom. So with this, we come to the end of this wonderful story. So the next story that we are going to read is going to be Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, but that is going to be in another video. I hope you enjoyed reading this story along with me. Leave me a comment and let me know. Please do like and share, and of course subscribe to my channel if you're new to it, and hit on the notification bell for my next videos. And of course, thank you so much for dropping by. Come back to hear me again. Till then, take care and bye-bye.